Every major leap in the history of human education involves the same underlying mechanism, taking the biological burden of memory and externalizing it into technology. Early oral traditions required learners to internalize knowledge manually. Through repetition and communal storytelling, the brain acted as the sole repository for a culture's history. The printing press initiated a different kind of offload. By pressing ink to paper, societies externalized the physical storage of information, allowing records to exist independently of the human mind. Centuries later, search engines and global internet databases expanded this capability, externalizing the retrieval of vast amounts of data in a matter of seconds. Generative AI introduces a new mechanic. While previous tools retrieved existing information, this technology automates the process of synthesizing and drafting content. The AI acts as an intermediary layer. It processes and packages information before the human ever interacts with the raw data. The integration of generative algorithms into the classroom changes the nature of how a student interacts with knowledge, making the concern over academic cheating a symptom of a much larger transition. When a machine can produce a finished artifact, the traditional focus on the end result starts to obscure the actual cognitive work being done. Human learning relies on cognitive friction, the necessary biological struggle of effortful recall, wrestling with ambiguity, and manually organizing data into structured thought. This friction physically creates synaptic reinforcement. It is a biological prerequisite for memory encoding and complex pattern recognition. Traditional learning forces the student to act as the synthesizer, doing the heavy lifting of translating messy information into coherent internal structures. We observe how generative tools rewire this pathway by introducing the AI-augmented architecture. Through cognitive outsourcing, the learner prompts the system and bypasses the manual labor of organizing thought. The system immediately feeds a polished synthesis back to the learner. This creates an illusion of mastery. The student reads a perfect summary and mistakes the algorithm's fluency for their own internal understanding. Consuming a generated summary does not build the internal mental scaffold required to evaluate the material or to reproduce that synthesis independently later. By outsourcing the synthesis of knowledge to machines, learners are essentially skipping the biological pathways required to build deep expertise. The rapid gratification of machine-generated answers imposes an attention tax, making it harder to sustain the focus required for deep study. This dynamic is intensely concentrated in intelligent tutoring systems, or ITS, platforms designed to optimize a student's learning curve through data. An ITS operates on a closed-loop architecture. It tracks student inputs, flags errors, and feeds back to algorithmic prompts to force an adjustment. This is highly effective, excelling at procedural scaffolding, micro-adaptations, and generating real-time diagnostic maps of knowledge gaps. But an ITS is structurally limited by its reliance on quantifiable data points, like time on task and response accuracy. To maintain procedural efficiency, the algorithm drops tacit knowledge, emotional states, and cultural context from the equation. Empathy, ethical mentorship, and the ability to read subtle nonverbal cues resist straightforward algorithmic coding. If students rely exclusively on these dominant models, the classroom faces a risk of knowledge homogenization. Without a human educator to challenge the machine's framing, students inherit the embedded biases and cultural paradigms of the AI's training data. While an intelligent tutoring system can optimize a procedural drill, its affective deficits leave students vulnerable to algorithmic bias without human intervention. For decades, the academic essay served as a reliable proxy to measure a student's internal cognitive effort, rather than merely evaluating the final text. Analog tools, like electronic calculators, assisted with arithmetic. They removed manual friction, but they still required the student to supply the underlying logic. Generative AI uncouples the final artifact from the student's intellectual labor, defeating this proxy. When we break down the components of an AI-assisted essay, the machine assumes the authorship burden, shifting the human role to prompting. This creates a crisis of authorship. Identifying plagiarism is no longer a binary task because the resulting cognition is heavily hybridized. Attempting to catch AI usage with surveillance tools alone misses the reality of how knowledge is produced in a networked environment. Measuring learning through static artifacts is a failing strategy. forcing institutions away from output-based assessment models. Instead of evaluating the final text, assessments are beginning to focus on the observable steps of the learning process itself. Modern assessments must trace the entire intellectual journey, grading students on how they engineer prompts, structure inquiries, and critically evaluate AI-generated claims. To verify actual comprehension, interactive methods like process portfolios and oral defenses are replacing the traditional take-home essay. This shift redefines the modern educator, transitioning them from a content source into an affective mentor. The educator's imperative is now to act as a curator of intellectual struggle, deliberately injecting necessary friction back into the learning process. In this new environment, the objective is integrating cognitive outsourcing into a framework of intentional design. By building hybrid cognitive ecosystems, combining the synthetic efficiency of AI with human critical autonomy, we preserve the ethical core of learning in the algorithmic age.